if the horse you lost returned from the shadows only to finish what was left undone. Tonight, discover a story of guilt, forgiveness, and a bond that even death couldn't break. If you love haunting tales of second chances, stay with us till the end. The fog came in before dawn, as it always did in the long months of autumn, when the winds off the sea carried the chill of old sorrows. From the high window of the lighthouse, Samuel Gray watched the silver banks of mist swallowing the shoreline below. He pressed a hand to the cold glass and let his breath fog a little circle through which he could glimpse the restless waves. This was the hour he both dreaded and longed for, the hour when the past felt nearest, when he could almost hear her voice carried on the tide. A storm had driven him here years ago, though the locals said it was something older and stranger that kept him anchored to the rocks. He had been 25 then, desperate to outrun the shame that clung to him after the war. The old keepers had spoken of the lighthouse as a place to start over, but Samuel soon realized it was just as much a place to be forgotten. The isolation suited him. He had no family left to write letters to, no friends brave enough to look him in the eye and pretend not to remember what he had done. He told himself that was why he had taken the post. But deep down, he suspected it was because he needed to feel the relentless judgment of the sea, to be reminded that some reckonings could not be escaped. The locals rarely ventured up the bluff after nightfall. They said the cliffs were cursed. Fishermen told tales in the taverns of the fog's appetite, how it swallowed voices, boats, entire men, how if you listened long enough you'd hear hoofbeats pacing the edge of the world. "Old superstition," Samuel would mutter as he lit the beacon, the flame searing back the darkness in its revolving circle. But there were nights when he heard it too, the muffled rhythm of a horse's canter, thudding across wet grass. He would press his ear to the cold stones and hold his breath, waiting for the sound to fade. Most mornings the dawn came clean and empty, but sometimes he would wake to find the ground churned by unshod hooves, the salt-damp earth scored as though some great beast had circled the tower all night. On those days, he kept the lantern burning past sunrise, as if light alone could hold the legends at bay. On the morning it all began, the fog was so thick he could not see the shore below. He set out with his lantern anyway, determined to check the storm shutters on the storage shed. He could hear the breakers crashing, but the world itself seemed hidden behind a white veil. Halfway down the path he stopped. In the hush, a low, steady breathing came out of the fog. The hairs on the back of his neck lifted. Slowly, he turned the lantern to the side. A shape resolved in the gloom, massive shoulders, the proud arch of a neck, the restless shifting of hooves against wet gravel. A horse. It stood perfectly still, watching him with eyes that gleamed an unnatural pale blue. Vapor rose from its flanks, mingling with the sea mist. As Samuel stared, he felt something inside him crack open, an old, unhealed fracture that had never stopped aching. He thought of his boyhood, the way he had once loved horses more than anything, of the war horse he'd been assigned in the cavalry, a gentle bay named Larkspur, who had trusted him utterly. He thought of how that trust had been broken in the last charge across the field when he had survived and Larkspur had not. He swallowed. The lantern shook in his hand. The horse took a step closer. Its breath billowed out in slow clouds. It seemed solid, but not entirely of this world. When he tried to focus on its muzzle, the details blurred, as if he were gazing through rippling water. "Easy," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't mean any harm." The horse lowered its head slightly. Samuel realized he was trembling. He forced himself to set the lantern down and extend his hand, palm open. For a heartbeat, the animal only regarded him, breath rising between them like a wall. Then, so slowly it felt unreal, it stepped forward, lowered its head, and pressed its icy muzzle into his palm. A shudder went through him. The touch was like nothing he had ever felt, weightless, but heavy with memory. He had the absurd sensation that if he closed his eyes, he would wake somewhere somewhere long ago, before the war, before the guilt. He swallowed hard. "What are you?" he whispered. The fog shifted behind the horse, swirling in uneasy eddies. The creature lifted its head, ears pricking toward the sea. Without a sound, it turned and began to walk down the path that led toward the cliffs. "Wait!" Samuel took a step after it, but the shape dissolved into the mist, leaving only the wet path and the pounding of his heart. He stood there a long time, until the lantern's flame guttered and died. That night he could not sleep. He sat in the lighthouse kitchen, the walls pressing close, and thought of the way the horse's eyes had looked right through him. He poured whiskey into a chipped cup, but it did nothing to steady his nerves. In the darkness, he could almost hear hoofbeats again, circling the tower, patient and inexorable. Samuel did not remember how he got back into the house that night. The wind had died to a hush, but inside him, a storm raged louder than ever. He collapsed onto the floor beside the cold fireplace, hands trembling. Through the haze of exhaustion, he heard the horse outside, hooves crunching slowly across the frozen grass, pacing, waiting. All night, sleep teased him only to pull away. He drifted in and out of uneasy dreams, the barn engulfed in flames, his father shouting, the horse screaming in terror. Every time he jerked awake, he thought he heard the creak of the stable door. By dawn, he could bear it no longer. He wrapped a wool coat around his shoulders and stepped outside. The world was blue and silent. The mare lifted her head from the trough, watching him with eyes that seemed deeper than any animal's. He stood there a long time, breathing the cold air. "You're not just a horse, are you?" he whispered hoarsely. The mare flicked her ears. A shiver coursed over her skin. When he turned to go back in, he noticed something by the porch steps. Hoof prints. But they weren't just from last night. They formed a pattern, looping around the house again and again, as though she'd been circling it for hours. Protecting it, or guarding him. A memory bloomed, sudden and vivid. His father's horse, Dove, the one he'd grown up feeding and brushing. He had loved her with the fierce, uncomplicated devotion of a lonely child. She'd been terrified of thunder. On the night of the fire, she had pulled against her lead rope until she fell. Samuel had always blamed himself. He hadn't been there to soothe her when the storm came. Now he stared at the mare in the yard, and the impossible thought struck him. Could it be her? But no. Dove had died that night. He'd buried her himself. Still, as he studied this animal, the same crescent-shaped scar was visible just above her foreleg. "Dove?" he choked out. The mare only watched him. But there was something in her stillness, an intelligence, a familiarity. He sank to his knees in the brittle grass, grief rushing up from the depths he'd thought sealed away. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry I left you. I'm sorry I ran." The wind stirred, a whisper through the dry reeds. "You didn't leave me." The words were not heard so much as felt. A thought pressed gently into his mind. "No," came the answering hush. The mare took a step forward. For the first time, she did not flinch when he reached out. His hand met her neck, warm and solid and real. Tears spilled down his cheeks. He had been running from this moment his entire life. From guilt, from loss, from the ache of never being forgiven. But now, he could no longer pretend. He was not alone. The next days blurred together. Samuel barely left the ranch. He fixed the fence, mended the tack room door, sorted old boxes in the barn. The mare followed him everywhere, quiet as a shadow. Neighbors came to check on him. They brought casseroles, newspapers, and cautious smiles. He thanked them politely, but as soon as they left, he'd step back into the yard, where she was waiting. Every night, the dreams grew clearer. Not nightmares anymore, but memories. Riding Dove across the fields as a boy, her mane whipping his face. Listening to his father hum an old hymn as he rubbed the mare's flanks after a long day. It was as if the horse had returned to help him remember who he'd been, who he still was beneath all the hurt. And yet, a sense of dread never fully lifted. One evening, As the sun disappeared behind the hills, Samuel stood by the pasture fence. The mare had her head low, grazing. He found himself speaking aloud, voice cracking. "What are you?" She lifted her face, eyes dark and fathomless. "I am what remains." His breath caught. "Of your father's love, of your own." He swallowed hard. "Are you here to take me with you?" The horse did not answer. But something passed between them, a shiver of finality, like a clock striking its last chime. Samuel realized that whatever had brought her back was not meant to last forever. That night, he couldn't sleep. He packed a small satchel, a flask, a photograph of his father, an old riding crop. As he buttoned his coat, he glanced at the picture. His father's weathered face, one hand resting on Dove's neck. He slipped it into his pocket. Outside, the mare was waiting. As he approached, she lowered herself so he could mount her back. His throat tightened. "Are you sure?" he asked, voice rough. "You are ready," came the thought, soft and steady. He climbed onto her. She felt exactly as she had all those years ago, powerful, reassuring, alive. And together, they turned toward the road that led away from the ranch. They rode all night. Past the split-rail fences, past the frost-burned meadows, past every place he had hidden from his memories, the stars wheeled overhead, brilliant and cold. The wind in his hair smelled of hay and salt and a sweetness he could never name. Hours blurred into a single sensation, the rhythm of hooves beneath him, the steady beating of a heart that was not only his. At dawn, they reached the bluff overlooking the river, the place where his father had taught him to ride. The mare stopped. He slid down to stand beside her. The first light gilded the water below. The trees rustled, and in that hush, he felt his father's presence so strongly he nearly wept. "I never forgave myself," he whispered. I thought I killed you both." The wind rose, tugging gently at his coat. "No," he looked into the mare's eyes. "You were a boy, you were afraid." Tears spilled freely. "And you, are you really her?" "I am all the love that never left you." He pressed his face against her neck, sobbing. For the first time in 30 years, the burden in his chest loosened. The hollow ache he had carried since that night finally began to fade. When he pulled back, the mare lifted her muzzle to the wind. She stepped away from him, toward the edge of the bluff. Samuel watched, heart thundering. "Don't go," he pleaded. "You are ready," she repeated. And then, without another sound, she turned into the dawn. Her outline shimmered, dissolving into light. In a heartbeat, she was gone. Samuel stood alone on the bluff, staring into the brightness. His body shook with cold, but something inside him felt warm. He knew she would not return, but he also knew she didn't need to. What she came to give, she had given. Forgiveness. Peace. The reminder that love endures beyond death. He looked down at the photograph in his hand. He raised it to the rising sun, letting the light pour over it. "I'll be all right," he said, and he meant it. Epilogue. In the weeks that followed, Samuel changed. Neighbors noticed how he smiled more easily, how his voice grew steady. He reopened the old riding trails. He began offering lessons to local children. Sometimes, late at night, he would walk to the empty pasture. He never saw her again. But now and then, when the wind was just right, he could almost hear hoofbeats in the grass. He would stand there in the dark, smiling and whisper, "Thank you." And in the hush that followed, the ranch felt less like a monument to loss, and more like a home at last. Thank you for listening to this story of Samuel and the horse who carried his past and his redemption. If this touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of love, loss, and the unexplained. And if you believe in second chances, tell us in the comments below. Until next time, keep your heart open, because sometimes what we lose comes back when we need it most.